Welcome everybody. Firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Lutchewita, Aboriginal land, and acknowledge with deep respect the traditional custodians of the land, the Palawa people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal community who continue to maintain their identity, culture and Aboriginal rights. So thanks for joining us today. I'm Darlene McLennan and I'm the Manager of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, ADCET for short. Today's topic is disability, higher education and e-learning, moving beyond accessible web design. Our presenters today are Tim Pittman and Mike Kent from Curtin University. I'm sorry to say one of our other presenters, Katie, is unwell today. Before we begin the presentation, I want to provide a few housekeeping items. This webinar, for those who haven't joined us before, is captioned by Bradley Reporting and will be recorded. The recording will be available on ADCET in the coming days. To activate your closed caption, you click on the CC button in the toolbar that is located either on the top or at the bottom of your screen. To increase the number of lines appearing in the caption box, click the small arrow on the top right-hand side. If you have any difficulties with your technology throughout the webinar, you can email us on admin@adcet.edu.au. The presentation, our presentations often run for around 50 minutes, but Tim and Mike are saying as Katie's not there, it may not go for as long, so you might get an early minute today. We also allow questions after the presentation, and normally that's done through me, as we can't often guarantee if people have microphones working. So throughout the presentation, please feel free to write your questions in the chat pod, and then I will ask them at the end. If you actually click the option to share with all panellists and attendees, others can actually see your questions, and even some people answer it or share other resources. So it's a great way to have another level of engagement in the webinar. All right, I think that's all. So now we're going to hand over to Tim and Mike. So thanks, guys.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay, Darlene?
Yep, we can.
Excellent. All right, thank you. And first, I'd also just like to join Darlene in acknowledgement. Mike and I are coming to you from Curtin University in Perth. We're located on Noongar Whadjuk land, and we also acknowledge the traditional owners and pay our respects. Today, Mike and I will be speaking. It'll be more or less half and half. I'll begin the conversation and move into the research, and then Mike will take on and develop the findings more fully. Our topic, as Darlene has said, is about disability, higher education, e-learning. And before we start, I do want to make an acknowledgement that throughout this conversation and our presentation, we will be talking about categories. Obviously, identifying as disability as a form of categorisation, and the higher education sector, the way data are collected creates certain subcategories within that. We acknowledge that this is part of the process of identification, and we also acknowledge that categorisation sometimes is done by the person who is being categorised, but other times it is done by them, and sometimes without their consent or without their support. Therefore, categories can help, they can hinder, but it's impossible for us to present this data today in the way that the sector collects it without creating and talking about these categories. I don't seek to problematise that or discuss it or come down for or against it, merely to acknowledge how these categories work. One thing I would say, and this is why categories are created in higher education disability reporting, is it makes the issue visible and active. The bottom line for institutions and democratic institutions and public policy is it's only when you report something counts and acknowledge that it starts to matter. And that can have some very strong benefits, obviously, in the area of disability support and disability research. By way of example, I just want to give you two examples of counting categories. These are the categories that the government has used in the last 25 years to report and count people with disability in higher education. They're about to change, but for the purpose of this presentation, we're using the ones used for the last quarter of the century. This is a count in 1992, and this is compared to the count in 2017. So it's just a proportional count, it's not raw numbers. And just putting those two columns against it, I think tells us a lot about categorisations and how it changes over time. In particular, how people defining as having disabilities associated with medical issues have exponentially grown. And the other category, the kind of miscellaneous category, has grown even more. And the other point that I would make is that in 1992, these categories were being filled in by disability support officers. In other words, they were people defining the students with disability, whereas in 2017 and today, it's the students themselves that are categorising. Just adds that layer of complexity that when you're looking at the issues that we're exploring and we talk about disability in technology or disability in e-learning, we are acutely aware as researchers that we're homogenising a very diverse group. First, the good news, and we can see in this chart that we have seen a really significant increase in participation by people with disability. The chart just tracks the last 10 years, and as it shows, we've seen the numbers more than double in this period. In 2009, there were a little over 30,000 students identifying as having disability, and at the most recent count, that was over 70,000. What is not clear is the extent to which this growth is a factor of actual growth, more students in the system, better reporting by universities, in other words, students that were always there but perhaps weren't being recorded as such, or a greater willingness or understanding to self-categorise or self-identify by the students themselves. That said, what we are still seeing is a flatlining or no change in the subsequent measures of success. So when we look at things such as, in this case, this graph tells us in their first year retention of students, the critical first year, surviving the first year of study. And we see that in the same period, even though the number of students with disability has really increased, they're still remaining stubbornly 3 or 4 percentage points behind the main cohort in terms of their retention. So it's one thing to get the students in, it's another thing to ensure that they actually get the successful outcomes that other students do. Another final thing to show how these categories really need to be looked at very closely. This looks at a cohort of students. The way government tries to identify completion, successful in other words, do students get through, is they take a cohort of students and they track them, in this case for up to 9 years, to really take into account people with part-time enrolments or enrolments that have been affected, so plenty of time or sufficient time to complete. And what we find is that for the 2005 bachelor cohort, after 9 years, the average completion rate is around 72%. So almost 3/4 of the student would have completed their course after 9 years. But for the various categories of disability, again, these are self-identified, we see that the completion rates are significantly lower, except when we get to the visual category, which has the same, in fact, fractionally above. So we must be very careful not to homogenise these groups when we're talking about them. Now onto the research project. This was a small seed project, just one university. We wanted to focus very much on how students with disability engage with and use technology to support their studies. It had 3 major parts. One was the environmental scale, the background and contextual review, the lit review. One was a very particular performance review of the case study institution, looking at internal KPIs, measures, milestones and publicly available data. But we just wanted to draw out a couple of slides, not the entire project, but we wanted to focus very much on what the online survey of students with disability told us. This is because the one we wanted to focus on this today is this is the student voice. This is the people, these are the students themselves telling us of their experiences, telling us of their likes and dislikes, and this is the one that we particularly wanted to focus on this morning. A little bit on the survey respondents. We're talking about a cohort group of 229, which for the institution, a C project was a good response, but obviously caution needs to be taken if you're extrapolating this to a wider understanding or wider findings across the sector. And again, we see the disparateness of the people in the category, in the cohort group and where they come from. One of the key questions we asked them was, we said, well, what technologies are you used? And we also wanted to see what the difference was, if there was any difference in technologies that the students use on campus and technologies used at home. And what we found was that ebooks and smartphone apps at university were the most commonly used technological devices. We then compared that to what they said and reported as using at home. Now, we didn't necessarily expect to see a difference there. We didn't expect to see a difference in devices, if you will, that at the university they would use some kinds of devices and at home they would use others. And indeed, the survey bore that out. They're just as likely to use the same devices at home that they are at university. But even though it's a kind of a straightforward comment to make, I think it's an important comment to make, and that is when you look at the counts, just the raw counts, students are using devices more at home. And this is really important when we think about inclusive design. I mean, it's a small thing, but it can be so easily overlooked at the institutional area. Because when institutions talk about inclusive design, the instinct is to think about your institution and say, well, how can we make our institution more inclusive, accessible in universal design, etc. And of course that needs to be done, and that's great. But then you also have to consider students that aren't on campus and spending significant periods of time not on campus. Our university, our institutions have to extend into there to also ensure that the way the things that we're doing on the university can also be delivered into the students' homes. And again, most institutions are aware of this and they are making attempts to do this. But I would argue that it needs to go also to a third level. And that is for us to remember that students, and in this case students with disability, are designing their own solutions, working out how best to support their own studies, sometimes in collaboration with the university, but often off their own bat, because they have a lifetime of experience and knowledge and they know what works best for them. And so we need to think about inclusive design also being about not projecting the institution out to the student, but to actually look at what the people are doing in their homes and saying to what extent can we redesign our universities to match or be compatible very much with what students were doing for 10, 12, 15 years before they even step foot or enrolled in our university. The next question is a little bit subjective, and it's asking students to think about what their preferences are when they're talking about using technology specifically designed for people with disability or mainstream technology. Now, the reason for asking this question, the impetus, is from a policy point of view, because the conversations we're having about supporting students with disability in universities go back a quarter of a century. And when you look at the early discussion papers around this, I'm thinking about a Fair Chance for All discussion paper by the Department of Education, Employment and Training in 1992. It's 1992, it's pre-internet, and they're imagining a world, or they're living, the policymakers are living in a world where it's very modernistic and the institutions are imagined as a place where a student with disability who has nothing or has insufficiencies in something goes to get the expertise, whether it's in people who can sign or creation of braille texts or large-scale copying of hard copies into more compatible or easy to read fonts or colours or creating audio tapes. The thought is that without the institution's financial, physical and expertise support, the student will not be able to access education. But now, of course, fast forward 25 years and we're living in a world where all these technological, many of these technological solutions are existing outside the university. And what we find is, whilst the students are saying to us, of course it depends on the issue, it depends on my particular needs and what kind of software or hardware I need, generally there's a much stronger tendency for them to say that mainstream technology is better than technology specifically designed for people with disability. And again, it's a heads up to the institution that it's not just for the institution to think themselves as experts in this area, but to understand what's happening in the wider environment and shape their institutions accordingly. So the overall findings of the study, this is the point at which I'll then pass on to Mike shortly, is that it's great to see that we're seeing a significant improvement in participation of people with disability, but that's only one measure of success. Widening access and participation is just the first step, a very important first step, obviously. But then we need to talk more about retaining these students and getting these students through to completion, and a positive completion, and then also what happens to them after university. We find that students with medical-related conditions are significantly overrepresented in these studies. These students have a particularly pressing need for technological support. We know that the most commonly assisted technologies are e-books and smartphones, and that we do believe that assistive technologies are becoming increasingly mainstreamed. And notwithstanding the need for some very specific technologies, students are saying it's the mainstream technologies that I tend to engage with most of the time and use most of the time. Universities still have a large role to play. Just because the students have these technologies at home and can source and become proficient with these technologies without university help, that doesn't mean that universities don't continue to have a very important part to play, such as creating the physical places in which these students can use these technological resources, and also socially including these students, particularly those studying online. So at this point, I'll pass over to my colleague Mike, and he'll take up from where I've left off. Thanks.
So once I got the microphone, thanks very much, Tim. Yes, I'm just going to talk a little bit now about some of the rationale for our study. It's quite strange. I put my glasses on, and then when I look at you people, when I look out at you at the screen, I can't really see, but when I look at my notes, I can. So forgive me if I seem a little bit in two places at once. So a little bit behind the justification for this study, and I suppose there's the moral and legal requirements for making this education accessible to people with disabilities. So if we do a bit of a chronological, then we can look at the Access to Education and Disability Discrimination Act from 1992, where it talks about how it's unlawful for an educational authority to discriminate against a student on the grounds of their disability, or by denying access to a student or limiting the student's access. That's unlawful for an education provider to discriminate against a person on the grounds of a person's disability, or by developing curricular or training courses having a content will either exclude a person from participation or subject the person to any other detriment. Now, for some of you in the industry, you may be following the debates around setting up the start of a course, saying these are the inherent requirements. I've got the right phraseology. Yep, yes. So the inherent requirements around a course. So, and some of these start to sail very close to the line about which side of this particular legal act we're on. So the universities are often trying to make the distinction between saying, well, it's okay, we can train you to be, I mean, a nurse is a classic example of it, but in order to be registered as a nurse, you need to meet these inherent requirements, which in fact are counter to what the Act is saying here. So that's a bit of an aside, I suppose, but it's like some of these things that actually go back quite a long way are sort of being wound back at the moment, which is a cause of concern. If we go forward to 2005, Disability Standards for Education set out some standards, so to eliminate as far as possible discrimination against a person on the ground of disability in the area of education and training, to ensure as far as practicable that persons with disabilities have the same rights to equity before the law in the area of education. And you can see suddenly rather than it is illegal to do this, it's something that is as far as practicable. So we sort of see that bit of that wind back happening back in 2005. And then to promote recognition and acceptance within the community of the principle that persons with disabilities have the same fundamental rights as the rest of the community. Next year, in 2006, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability again highlighted the importance of physical, social, economic, cultural environment to health and education, information and communication for students with disability, to ensure people with disabilities are able to live independently and access on an equal basis with others, the physical environment, transportation, information and communications, and to ensure that persons with disability are able to access general tertiary education, vocational training, adult education, lifelong learning without discrimination on an equal basis with others. I quite like Article 24 there because it's pretty unambiguous what they're saying, and Australia is obviously a signatory to this this convention. So with that as the legal background, so I'm making my hand gestures off the screen. I know Tim, you're very good at having them in front of you. This, I suppose, highlights where we're coming from. At what point are we dealing with equality and equity, and how does that apply to people with disability, particularly accessing higher education? Now, part of the motivation for this study came from some prior work and ongoing work that we've been doing, looking at the use of captions for recorded lectures, particularly in an online context, but also for students on campus who might benefit from that technology. And prior to that, we looked at sort of broader questions around access and use of technology. Some of my research looking at OUA, and then specifically at this university, at Curtin University. But the thing that I think we extended with this study was looking at some of the outcomes, and also getting a better appreciation for the student voice in terms of the online survey. So just concluding now with some of the recommendations that we came up with. And some of these, obviously, as Tim was saying, this was very much a study that was aimed specifically at this one institution, and some of these recommendations then speak directly to the university. So the first is, as soon as practical, the university should adopt an efficient automated captioning system for recorded lectures to provide a timely captioning service to all students. In our survey, the number of students commented that they found that the provision of captions was very important. They also found that the way that we do captioning at the moment, which is a manual external captioning service, often takes more than a week to turn around. And students were saying that by then the actual learning and teaching has moved on, so they're only getting access to the lecture once everyone else has stopped discussing that particular course material. This is a potential workaround, but obviously there's issues around the effectiveness of automated captioning systems and how well it works, particularly in different topics. So I know that a recent study they did at the University of Western Australia found that different subject areas work less well and better with automated captioning. So that's something to consider in future. So the second recommendation was the consideration needs to be given to an inclusive digital strategy that embraces students with complex medical disabilities as well as those in the other category. I know I've spoken here at ADCET previously about the other category of students with disabilities, which is sort of a way where we bundle up students with acquired brain injury, intellectual disabilities and mental illness. And the way that breaks down is it's very dominated by students with mental illness, but it's almost the stigma associated with that particular type of impairment means that we can't even use its name, but it also then means we're not very good at accommodating for those students. Similarly, complex medical disabilities provide challenges where you have students which might have fluctuating levels of impairment. How do we tend to have a very regimented, our semesters are going to be 13 weeks long. You need to finish within a certain period of time. How does that accommodate people who are very capable of doing their studies for, say, bursts of 4 weeks at a time, but then need gaps? How do we sort of accommodate that? And as I was just reading this, it's interesting that the other students that had poor outcomes, as we saw in the earlier slides, with those with mobility disabilities. And I suppose in this recommendation I didn't include those students, probably because of my own bias, because they tend to be much more obvious on campus. But nonetheless, the fact that they're getting really poor outcomes also raises a whole lot of important questions. So, and then, when I'm writing my notes for this talk, I'm like, how do we make higher education as accessible as students with visual impairment or blindness? And then I'm like, well, or is everybody? So there's obviously we're doing better with different types of impairments, but none of them are doing as well as students who don't have a disability. In our survey, 33% of respondents said that the digital technologies that have been provided to them by the university were inadequate. That's a pretty, given the universities invest in these technologies to make study more accessible for students, it's a pretty low hit rate. So that's something that I think is an area where more research is needed to see what students are using. And as Tim was saying before, the use of sort of more mainstream accessibility technology has changed a lot over the last 25 years. How do we better incorporate that and target it to try and improve some of these outcomes? And I suppose related to that is technical support, particularly for students who are external to campus, where we had a very low rate of, it was acknowledged that they weren't getting the technical support they needed in many cases. And finally, one of the other comments that came up was, and I'm not sure this is necessarily specific for students with disabilities, although obviously these were students with disabilities we're getting this commentary from, around the support, the provision of social and emotional support. The students highlighted the fact that when you're studying externally, it's very isolating. So how can we get that other element, which is still using technology, but not providing technology as such, but using technology to provide social and emotional support. I'd like to acknowledge, in fact we both like to acknowledge that this research was funded through a Curtin Teaching Innovation Scheme grant from 2018, and we are very grateful for that. And I think now we would like to take questions. Yeah, I've got everyone's answer. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much for that. That's fantastic, Tim and Mike. Yeah, some interesting data there and some information. So we've got a couple of questions. So one of the questions was they were just wondering whether participants self-reported multiple disabilities, such as a hearing and a vision impaired students, or so forth within the data set you're collecting.
Yes, there was a high level of reporting of multiple impairment types.
Yep, excellent. Did the study include expectations of students on what would be provided in terms of technology in comparison with their experience once they commenced their study? Did they have?
Sorry, could you repeat?
So yeah, so did the study include expectations of students on what would be provided in terms of technology in comparison with the experience once they commenced their study? So yeah, did students kind of have an expectation coming to university that this would be provided, that would be provided, and then actually get there and it's not the case?
No, we didn't include that question.
Yep.
Would have been a lovely question.
It would have been, wouldn't it? Yeah, to see if we're meeting.
We should take our scoping study to the group.
Yeah, definitely. Well, no, please do. That'd be great. And so there was another one here. Sorry, I've just changed my things here. In regards to the categorisation of disability, do you have any thoughts on the national consistent collection on data of school students with disabilities? I don't know if you've come across that. We did talk about it the other day, Tim, didn't we? So have you got any thoughts on that at all?
Can you hear me okay through this?
Yep, we can.
I do. I find this is a very interesting area for me as a person who doesn't identify as having a disability. There is a real sense of I feel awkward and hesitant about this, and so but coming into this, if you will, cold, for want of a better word, my departure point is first the consistency. I'm a sociologist, I collect social data, and consistency is paramount because otherwise you can't make meaningful comparisons and you can't make reasonable conclusions. But I operate from the premise that when we're in the area of disability, asking a student to identify as having disability, let alone identifying what type of disability, you have to be able to demonstrably prove that in identifying the student, there is either a direct benefit to the student or there is an indirect benefit to society. In other words, by identifying, that will allow us, the institution, to help you, or it may not allow us to directly help you, but in collecting that data, it can help us become more knowledgeable and understanding of the situation, and therefore we can actually make improvements for the sector as a whole. And that's where I'm really interested. I'm saying my whole 12 months this fellowship, this work I'm doing, is I really am wanting to hear from people with disability about what these categorisations do for them and do to them. I understand, the more I speak to people with their own lived experience, the more I understand how these forms of self-identification are very important in terms of how they identify themselves, who they communicate with, who they relate to, who they draw support from, etc. What I'm still not sure on is why this data are being collected by a federal government agency, and at least to me, it seems to be sitting there and not doing anything. So that's what I'm concerned about. Why collect data if you don't then act on the data? So this, I don't know if that answers the question, darling. That's the concern I have.
Yep. No, it probably, and look, the national consistent collection of data, yeah, it's kind of a big question as well. So, yeah, so I probably didn't answer it, but I think you kind of asked more questions in that, so which is great. And I suppose it's a good time to give a plug for tomorrow's webinar, which will be Tim presenting on the fellowship that he's started to undertake with the National Centre, along with David. David from also doing a fellowship with the National Centre. So we've got them tomorrow, I think at 1 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, I think we're in at the moment now. So, but we'll give it a plug at the end as well. Another question was, can you recommend ways that we can reduce the homogenisation, how do you say that, you know, the homogenise of people with disabilities that currently happen?
Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because it sort of it produces questions around universal design, where we sort of want to create a homogenous everyone.
Yeah.
So trying to make everything accessible in multiple ways for different people. I think it's particularly important if we're looking at the other category of disability, that trying to engage with that in a sensible way, when we're talking about, you know, even if we look at a smaller category within that of mental illness, and suddenly we're dealing with people who may have anxiety, depression, PTSD. I mean, they're the three most common. Schizophrenia. They are not all mental illness that you make accessible in the same way. Everyone has separate needs, and I think part of it is people being prepared to talk about and acknowledge it. So I suppose getting back to what you were just saying about, you know, there needs to be some payback for us for basically breaching people's privacy or asking them to disclose.
Yeah.
Similarly, when people are disclosing, you need to have enough granularity to actually be able to engage with making education more accessible for people. In fact, the whole world more accessible for people.
Yeah. And to that I'd add, this is an absolute conflict in disability research. It's called the, some people call it the recognition redistribution paradox. I mean, you could write PhDs on it, so I'm desperately trying to summarise it here, but essentially, as a sociologist, I come from the redistribution end of the scale. In other words, put aside disability for a minute, you look at something like poverty. You say poverty is a barrier, it's a social and economic barrier. We need to acknowledge poverty and acknowledge the ways in which it works against a person. And our end goal is to eliminate poverty. The policies of redistribution about giving those who need is we're trying to efface that distinction. We're trying to say poverty no longer exists. Being working class is no longer a social and economic stigma. That's the side of redistribution. From a cultural perspective, you have what you call the policies or the acts of recognition, which is to say there is nothing wrong with being disabled. Disabled is a part of my identity. It's something that makes me who I am, and therefore I do not wish to efface it. I wish to acknowledge it and champion and celebrate it, and that gives me community of practice. It gives me people who I can relate to, and it gives me an identity in the same way that people identify as supporting a football team or identify as coming from a part of the world. And these two are in conflict. If you go from the 70s, the 80s and the early 90s, the government was just completely about redistribution. It was all about disability as a social and economic barrier. We wish to efface that barrier. But now we're getting into more nuanced discussions where the communities are saying to us, that's great, we obviously don't want barriers, but we don't want you to efface our identity in the process of getting rid of these barriers. And it's an ongoing tension. It's how do you remove the barriers without removing the distinction? And like I say, people are writing PhDs on it, so I can't give you a straight answer in this webinar. I'm really sorry, Darlene.
No, but it's brilliant though. It's good. And no, I love the discussion. I mean, the next question, I suppose, kind of goes against that in the sense of that universal design. And I suppose if we're going to look at universal design, yeah, as you said, kind of we continue to realise that, yeah, that we people identify with disability and and so forth. But the question was, do you have any thoughts about how universities could best work together to look at universal design and technology together? So just that sense of trying to avoid the reinvention. We are a large sector, but in some ways we're also a connected sector. Is there ways that you think we could work collectively together to improve the practice of universal design around technology?
I think we can acknowledge that some institutions are doing it much better than others, and trying to learn from what could be, what might be best practice. So, here in Western Australia, just as a sort of by example, I know Murdoch University does very well with recruitment of students with disabilities compared to the sector at large. So looking at what they're doing, I mean, again, that's only access rather than completion. But clearly something, if you look at the stats, something different is happening there. What is that? And so I think we in a way, we've sort of been forced into an approach where most universities are following their own policy. So I think that the very first step in that process would be to look at what's working in what areas and how to sort of distribute that across, where appropriate at least, distribute that across the sector, because there does seem to be a large variation in what outcomes are for different institutions in different categories, so retention or completion or success. So I think that would be a good first step. I think having something like the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education works, is another good thing that we've got working for us.
I was going to go to purely pragmatic level, follow the money, and one way to do it would be to say that the more money that goes to ADCET, National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, because then they're saying, if you want to do action or you want to do research, in other words, whether it's scholarship or infrastructure building or research, if we have coordinated national organisations in control of that research and action, then they will obviously just say, everything you do then goes to the whole sector. So yeah, I'd follow the money and start giving the money not to universities directly, but to the organisations that the community, the disability community says, these are the people who speak on my behalf.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So that kind of leads to a bigger question, is that, disability is probably one of the people with disabilities are the biggest, or getting to be the biggest, or fastest growing equity group, I suppose, not necessarily the biggest, but the fastest growing equity group. And we're not seeing that prioritisation around the financial, the money that is kind of then follows that increase in that equity group. Is there anything that you think could be done to kind of improve that, to work towards kind of a better financial?
Some of this study hints at the potential for mainstream accessible technology. So stuff that's coming out of the box, like just an iPhone or an Android phone with its suite of accessibility functions. The automated captioning services that are just coming as a standard free app and that sort of thing. I think there's a lot of resources that we're perhaps not deploying effectively, or talking to our students about deploying effectively. And I think that that's sort of extremely low-hanging fruit that we could really really work with. And you know, it's a bit unfortunate in this study, similar to the question about how we didn't ask people what their expectations were. You know, we weren't able to then burrow down into expert users going, okay, well, you use this technology at home really effectively. What do you do, and how can we use you as an exemplar for other students who might be in the same position?
Yep. Yeah, and I think a lot of universities are doing that, you know, around getting, you know, collective, you know, students, you know, working together, sharing. Like I know that a couple of universities have read and write, for example, user groups. So you're actually sharing that practice against, you know, with each other, which is a fantastic outcome. You know, and the Ofsted list, for those who aren't aware, there is a listserv for disability practitioners and academics that actually share good practice and also put out questions for each other, which, you know, and so that's, you know, if you are trialling new technologies or looking at technologies that may support, you know, a student with particular needs or so forth, that group actually works really well to help, you know, yeah, provide information. I don't think I've ever actually come across a sector that shares so freely, which is just a delight. So
Yeah.
now we've got some time for some more questions if anybody wants another question. We have got one more, but just to give a quick plug while people are thinking about questions, Jane's put into the chat panel the next webinar we're doing tomorrow, but also we have a range of information around inclusive technology on the website, ADCET, so please feel, including the free you know, apps from Apple, etc. So there's a whole heap of information if people wanting more information around that. So another question we've got, Tim and Mike, in terms of a more effective provision of technology adjustments and students playing a more active role designing their own solutions, do universities utilise assessment processes that focus on functional need rather than disability labels? Are you aware of, I mean, I suppose that question would be to Curtin. Do you know if they do that, or?
Yeah, my understanding is they've definitely moved to functionality. In other words, the focus. And again, this is why I find it's interesting that the categories that they collect focus on the disability. But when you speak to the disability support officers, certainly the ones I've spoken to, not just at this university and others, it's all around functions, functional needs. You know, what do we need to ensure that the education can be delivered? I think the people that are dealing directly with the students are acutely aware of this and absolutely driven by the functional approach. It's the extent to which that then flows through the actual institution itself and is delivered that I think we've still got problems.
Excellent. Well, no other questions have come through. Is there any final remarks from either of you guys?
Not from me. Just thank you very much for the opportunity to let's talk about this.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for the questions as well. It's always good to sort of get some, I suppose, feedback and interest in what's happening. I look forward to your webinar tomorrow too.
Yeah, yeah, no, and it's it's a fantastic research project, and yeah, I think there's potential, as you said in the recommendations, for further research in this area, and also even to expand what, you know, beyond Curtin and find out more across the country. So yeah, so as we said, the webinar has been recorded and it will be on ADCET in a couple of days. We might even get an article written about the research, because I think there's some questions in that we can need to keep asking ourselves as a sector. So well done to you both, and to Katie, and thank you for giving your time to us.
Thanks very much.
Okay, and thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you to the captioner today.